The ground was still trembling on the morning of August 6, 1944. Smoke hung low over the hedgerows near St. Lo, turning the bocage into a gray labyrinth of blasted trees and churned earth. German Grenadier Günter Grave pressed his face into the dirt, tasting chalk and gunpowder. The thunder of the previous day's bombardment still rang in his skull. American heavy bombers, more than 1,500 of them, had pounded his sector during Operation Cobra. General Fritz Bayerlein would later call it a landscape of the moon, and Grave knew he was lucky to have survived at all. Around him, his regiment was scattered, their fighting spirit broken not by infantry, but by a storm of steel from the sky. When the Americans finally advanced, their rifles looked oddly familiar, yet utterly foreign. The men carried the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic .30-06 rifle that spat 8 rounds in quick succession, a weapon capable of 40 to 50 shots a minute in practiced hands. Grave clutched his Kar 98K bolt action, slower, deliberate, suddenly antiquated in the face of American firepower. He had been taught that Germans were the inheritors of military tradition, Americans mere amateurs. Yet here, amid the ruin of Normandy, he saw a different truth. Captured, he was herded into a column of prisoners. Fear gnawed at his stomach. He had heard stories of how Russians treated captives, of starvation, beatings, and worse. He expected a rifle butt to the ribs, maybe days without food. Instead, an American private, face streaked with grime, pressed a cigarette into his hand. Another offered a Hershey bar, its sweet smell cutting through the stench of smoke and sweat. The chocolate melted slightly in his palm, an absurd luxury on this battlefield of death. As they were marched away, Grave noticed the logistical ballet unfolding behind American lines. Trucks rumbled forward, engines growling with the steady rhythm of an army in motion. Columns of GMC, CCKW, deuce-and-a-half trucks hauled crates of rations and ammunition with the inevitability of a river flowing to the sea. The Germans had once believed the Americans could not sustain prolonged campaigns. Now Grave saw convoys stretching into the horizon, proof of a machine that seemed impossible to stop. The prisoners were loaded into open trucks. Grave clutched the cigarette and chocolate, baffled. In that moment, the war he thought he understood tilted. This enemy, wealthy enough to hand candy to prisoners, organized enough to turn a battlefield into a supply depot, was unlike any he had imagined. The road dust rose around him as the convoy rumbled west. His stomach, knotted with fear, loosened with the sweet taste of chocolate. Somewhere behind them, artillery still cracked in the distance. Ahead, the unknown awaited. Engines growled like thunder rolling across the French countryside. It was August 1944, and Sergeant Jack O'Donnell leaned out of his GMC CCKW truck, the wind thick with dust and diesel fumes. He was one of thousands of drivers on the Red Ball Express, a rolling artery of supply trucks that connected Normandy's beaches to Patton's armored spearheads. To O'Donnell, it was just another day behind the wheel, but to the captured Germans watching from roadside cages, it was a revelation. Each truck was a workhorse. The GMC CCKW 2.5-ton 6x6, nicknamed the Deuce-and-a-Half. Powered by a GMC 270 inline-6 engine, it could carry 5,000 pounds of cargo at up to 45 miles per hour. Over 562,000 of them had been built, more than any army in history had ever fielded. Their olive-drab columns never seemed to end. To O'Donnell, they were just trucks. To German prisoners, the sheer number was staggering. America produced in months what Germany could not in years. The Red Ball Express was relentless. More than 5,900 vehicles operated day and night, headlights covered by slitted blackout shields, drivers forbidden to stop for anything but death or breakdown. At its peak, the system delivered 12,000 tons of supplies daily, gasoline, ammunition, rations, feeding 28 divisions in motion. It was an impossible figure for Germans to grasp. A single day's fuel burn by these convoys equaled what a panzer army might receive for a month. O'Donnell thought little of the math. His focus was the road, dodging potholes, praying his brakes held on steep descents. But sometimes he caught glimpses of the prisoners. They watched silently, hands gripping wire fences, eyes following the trucks. He could see the disbelief etched in their faces. The convoy's rhythm had its own poetry. Tires hissed over gravel, gearboxes whined. The scent of hot oil and exhaust filled the air. O'Donnell and his fellow drivers, many barely 20 years old, farm boys and factory kids, were unwitting emissaries of American power. They delivered not just bullets and beans, but a demonstration of what industrial democracy could achieve. As dusk fell, the trucks kept rolling. O'Donnell lit a Lucky Strike, its glow flickering against the windshield. Behind him, another convoy rolled forward, headlights blinking like fireflies. The Germans behind the wire whispered among themselves, unable to believe an enemy could mobilize such endless abundance. O'Donnell tapped the steering wheel, humming a tune from Detroit. He didn't know it then, but his convoy was reshaping the war. The cornfields of Iowa stretched golden under the autumn sun in 1944. Wind hissed through tall stalks, bending them gently as German prisoners shuffled down the dirt road under guard. Clara Jensen stood on her porch, apron dusted with flour, and watched the line pass. They were boys, really, thin, sunburned, their once proud uniforms replaced by denim work clothes stenciled PW. Some still carried themselves stiffly, trying to preserve a sense of rank, but most looked simply tired. The war had emptied American farms of young men. Clara's husband worked the land with his father, but their labor alone could not bring in the harvest. Across Iowa, as in dozens of states, German POWs filled the gap. They were contracted under Geneva rules, paid 80 cents a day in canteen scrip. Farmers like the Jensens paid the government prevailing wages, grateful for the hands. At first, Clara had felt uneasy. These were the enemy, men whose comrades had bombed London, sunk ships, fought in Africa. But as she handed water to a pair of prisoners one hot afternoon, she noticed their politeness, their quiet gratitude. One spoke halting English. "Danke." "Thank you, madam." She realized with surprise that he couldn't have been older than her brother, gone now with the 34th Infantry Division in Italy. The POWs marveled at the abundance. The barns brimmed with corn, the pantry stocked with flour and sugar. They picked apples that weighed heavy on the branches and loaded wagons until their arms shook. At lunch, Clara served sandwiches and coffee. The Germans whispered to each other in disbelief. Back home, their families rationed bread and eked out ersatz coffee from acorns. Some prisoners admitted quietly that the rations here were better than what they had known as soldiers in the Wehrmacht. In the evenings, Clara's children watched from the fence as the men filed back to their camp. One carried a small bundle of canteen purchases, chocolate, perhaps, or a bottle of Coca-Cola. They had learned quickly how far their 80 cents went in an American camp. Cigarettes, sweets, even postcards to send home. For young men who expected cruelty, it was a bewildering luxury. Clara listened to them singing one evening as the sun dipped low. German folk songs carried on the breeze, strangely mournful yet comforting. She thought of her brother overseas and wondered if German families heard American songs across the ocean. The next morning, as the prisoners bent to the fields again, one of them whispered to his comrade, "In Germany, we have nothing. Here, even prisoners have money." The Atlantic smelled of salt and oil as the Liberty ship's engines shuddered to life. Aboard its steel decks, German prisoners leaned against railings, staring across the New York skyline as it rose like a dream. For many, it was their first glimpse of America. The enemy, they had been told, was decadent and weak. Yet already, They were struck dumb by what they saw. The ship itself was the first revelation. A Liberty ship was no luxury liner. Officially designated EC-2SC-1, it was built for one purpose: moving mountains of war materiel. At 441 feet long, it could carry over 9,000 tons of cargo. More than 2,700 of these vessels had been built in wartime yards, assembled with such speed that one record-breaking hull was completed in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Most took around 42 days, still faster than Germany could even plan a keel. For the prisoners crowded in the holds, the statistics were incomprehensible. Germany launched a few dozen submarines each year, sweating over every rivet. America launched 3 Liberty ships a day. The sheer volume was a weapon in itself, overwhelming by its inevitability. On deck, the POWs smelled another surprise: tobacco. Crates of Lucky Strikes sat stacked beside cartons of rations. GIs lit cigarettes casually, tossing extras to each other. Some guards, with a shrug, handed them to the prisoners as well. The Germans puffed in silence, their disbelief growing. Back home, tobacco had been rationed into thin, bitter rolls. Here it was so plentiful that even enemies could waste it in smoke drifting out to sea. The voyage west was long, but each day revealed another glimpse of abundance. Meals, though simple, were filling. Bread and meat, coffee in tin mugs, even canned fruit. It was more than many had eaten in months. The ship's crew worked with brisk efficiency, sailors who had drilled this routine until it seemed as natural as breathing. For America, mass production extended even to manpower. Civilians turned mariners, factory workers turned soldiers. As the Liberty ship steamed into port, a prisoner leaned on the rail, gazing at cranes unloading cargo in endless rhythm. Trucks waited in neat rows, engines idling, ready to carry the supplies inland. It was then that one German officer muttered what others were thinking: "They build them faster than we can sink them." For the POWs, that single sentence was both confession and revelation. The war was no longer about bravery or tradition. It was about production, and America had already won. The estate outside Washington, D.C. looked like any other Virginia property: rolling lawns, brick buildings, and tidy fences. But to the men arriving in unmarked buses in 1944, it was a fortress of secrets. The Army called it Fort Hunt, though no maps admitted its existence. For its prisoners, it was known only as P.O. Box 1142. Here, America held some of the Reich's most valuable captives: U-boat captains, rocket scientists, and intelligence officers whose knowledge could alter the course of the war. Captain Harold Levy adjusted his glasses as he stepped into the interrogation room. A Jewish-American officer, he had lost cousins in Europe. Yet his orders were clear: no torture, no brutality. The goal was information, not vengeance. His tools were patience, fairness, and an unexpected weapon: abundance. The prisoner before him, a naval engineer, looked suspicious at the untouched tray on the table. Fresh bread, real coffee, even a cigarette waiting to be lit. Levy slid it across and spoke in fluent German, his tone calm. The engineer hesitated, then took the smoke, exhaling slowly. Small comforts loosened tongues where threats might have failed. Over weeks, the pattern repeated. Captives were treated humanely, given meals equal to American officers, and engaged in casual conversation rather than shouted interrogation. They would have expected hunger and fear. Instead, they found civility backed by an economy that could afford to feed even its enemies with meat and coffee. From such conversations came revelations about the V-2 rocket program, the new Type 21 U-boat, and German radar defenses. The intelligence saved lives. Convoys adjusted tactics, bomber raids shifted targets, and Allied planners prepared for weapons that might have otherwise struck unseen. The secret was never cruelty. It was the confidence of a nation so certain of victory that it could treat its enemies with decency and still extract what it needed. Levy often thought about the irony. The men across the table had once believed in a system that exalted brutality as strength. Yet here they were, undone by cigarettes, patience, and the sheer weight of American production. Even their fear eroded when they realized that no hunger awaited them, only the strange generosity of democracy at war. When the prisoner finally admitted a detail about submarine fuel systems, Levy closed his notebook. He had what he needed. Outside, trucks carried supplies past the Potomac. Inside, another secret turned to Allied advantage. As he watched the engineer escorted back to his quarters, Levy wondered how many lives would be saved by a single conversation carried on over bread, coffee, and a lucky strike. Snow fell softly over Algona, Iowa, in December 1944. Inside a makeshift workshop at the prisoner of war camp, 3 German soldiers bent over plaster molds, their hands white with dust. Eduard Kaib, Horst Wendlandt, and Erich Knoll were far from the battlefields where they had once fought. Tonight they worked by lantern light, crafting something that would outlast the war, a nativity scene. The camp itself was ordinary by American standards: rows of barracks, a mess hall, a canteen stocked with chocolate, cigarettes, and Coca-Cola. For the prisoners, it was extraordinary. Barracks were heated, food was plentiful, and they earned scrip for their labor in nearby fields. After years of shortages, the abundance seemed unreal. Here, in the heartland of the enemy, they found more security than their families back in Germany. The Nativity Project began as a pastime. The men scavenged materials from plaster and wood, shaping figures of Mary, Joseph, and the Christ child. Soon shepherds, angels, and animals joined the tableau. Each detail was careful, almost reverent. Other prisoners wandered in to watch, some lending hands, others simply marveling that such beauty could emerge in captivity. Outside the wire, townspeople grew curious. When the Nativity was unveiled that Christmas, locals and guards alike came to see. The figures glowed in the lamplight, 65 in all, arranged in a scene that felt both timeless and utterly foreign to war. Clara Jensen, who had once eyed the prisoners with suspicion, stood among the crowd. She heard them singing German carols, voices rising into the snowy night, and felt the sharp contrast. Enemies yesterday, artisans tonight. For the prisoners, the scene was more than art. It was survival. In shaping plaster, they reclaimed a sense of humanity stripped by battle. In creating beauty, they answered propaganda that had painted their captors as monsters. The irony was unmistakable. In the camps of their enemy, they found the space to create something their own homeland, bombed and starving, could no longer provide. By the time the war ended, the Nativity had become a local treasure. Each December it was displayed in Algona, a reminder of the strange intimacy forged between captor and captive. For men like Kaib and Wendlandt, it became a memory of unexpected dignity, of how abundance and fairness had turned humiliation into gratitude. As the lanterns were extinguished that night, snow still falling outside, the figures remained. Symbols carved not just from plaster, but from the unlikely realization that even in defeat, there was grace to be found in America. The Texas sun was merciless in July 1945, hammering down on cotton fields where German prisoners bent to their work. Sweat soaked through denim uniforms stenciled PW, hats pulled low against the glare. The air smelled of dust and diesel from the trucks that ferried them in each morning. What stunned the prisoners was not the labor, they were used to toil, but what awaited them when the day was done. At the camp canteen, the line moved quickly. Each man carried 80 cents in scrip earned for the day's work. Behind the counter, shelves groaned with goods. Hershey bars, Lucky Strikes, Coca-Cola chilled in glass bottles, ice cream scooped into paper cups. The German stood in disbelief. Back home, bread was rationed in thin slices, tobacco rolled from weeds, sugar a fading memory. Here, even captives chose between chocolate and cigarettes as if browsing a store. Some prisoners laughed nervously, others fell silent. They bought what they could carry, packs of Camels, candy bars, soft drinks, and sat at tables under humming fans. A few wrote letters, their pencils scratching across postcards, describing the impossible, food enough to grow fat in captivity. Studies later confirmed it. Many POWs gained 20 to 40 pounds during their years in America. It was a cruel irony. Their families starved under Allied bombing while they themselves ate better than they had as soldiers in the field. The abundance seemed like waste to men who had fought over every liter of fuel and crumb of bread. A day's gasoline for the Red Ball Express exceeded the entire fuel ration of some panzer divisions. American soldiers tossed half-smoked cigarettes aside. Prisoners scrambled to collect them, unable to fathom such casual excess. Yet the generosity worked its own kind of warfare. Men who expected to be humiliated instead found themselves respected. They were paid, fed, and treated as if their lives still had value. The contrast with Nazi promises of German superiority was jarring. Here was a democracy that drowned them not in hatred, but in plenty. One evening, as the sun bled out over the horizon, a German sergeant leaned back from his meal, belly full, and shook his head. "They have so much," he murmured to a fellow prisoner. "They give it even to us." The words carried down the line of tables, a confession none dared speak before. The war had always been unwinnable. The next morning the trucks came again, engines idling in the heat. The prisoners climbed aboard, pockets heavy with scrip, their disbelief deepening with each passing day. America's waste was not waste at all. It was victory made visible. March 7th, 1945. The night was cold along the Rhine, the water black and swift under the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. German engineers had wired the span with explosives, confident it would collapse before the Americans could reach it. Yet when the U.S. 9th Armored Division arrived, the charges failed. Under moonlight, the impossible happened. The bridge still stood. First came the infantry, running across planks that shuddered with every step. Then came the Shermans, M4 tanks weighing 30 tons, their tracks clattering over steel beams. Each crossing defied belief. The Wehrmacht had expected weeks to prepare defenses east of the river. Instead, within hours, the U.S. Army poured men and machines across Germany's last great natural barrier. The technical achievement was staggering. Engineers swarmed the bridge, reinforcing struts under constant artillery fire. Bulldozers pushed rubble aside as cranes lifted replacement beams into place. Every available CKW truck rolled forward, headlights dimmed, hauling supplies to the far bank. By the third day, more than 25,000 troops and countless vehicles had crossed. The Germans fired V-2 rockets, artillery, even Luftwaffe attacks. But the tide did not stop. For captured Germans watching from makeshift stockades nearby, the sight was shattering. They had been told that the Rhine was impenetrable, that its waters would guard the fatherland as surely as the Atlantic guarded America. Yet here, under searchlights and moonglow, they saw the river conquered not with heroic charges, but with engineering, logistics, and sheer speed. The contrast was cruel. German divisions rationed ammunition to a few shells per gun, their trucks parked for lack of fuel. Meanwhile, Americans wasted gasoline idling in queues, waiting for their turn to cross. Where Germany struggled to move a battalion, America shifted entire armies in days. An older prisoner muttered to a guard, "We never had a chance." The guard said nothing, only adjusted his rifle and kept watching the endless line of Shermans rolling east. The bridge would finally collapse 10 days later, weakened by stress and bombardment. But by then, it no longer mattered. Pontoon bridges had sprouted up, and the U.S. advance was unstoppable. The Rhine, once Germany's shield, became the highway to its defeat. As the moon sank into dawn, the water below glistened with reflections of armored columns and supply trucks. To the prisoners, the message was unmistakable. America's strength was not in mythic heroes, but in a system that turned steel, fuel, and men into an unstoppable current. The siding stretched farther than the eye could follow, steel rails glinting under a pale winter sun. Along them stood rows of M4 Shermans, hatches sealed, paint still smelling of the factory floor. To an American crewman, they were just machines waiting for assignment. To a German prisoner working nearby, they looked like a forest of iron trees, growing faster than war could cut them down. The numbers defied imagination. By the war's end, American factories had produced over 49,000 Shermans. In 1943 alone, U.S. aircraft production reached 85,000 planes, more than the Luftwaffe could muster in the entire conflict. The GMC CCKW deuce-and-a-half trucks, 562,750 of them, were built in such quantities that even wastage seemed irrelevant. And Liberty ships, 2,710 of them, slid from shipyards at a pace that turned oceans into Allied highways. For the German POWs who glimpsed these stockpiles during transport, it was like staring at proof of a divine imbalance. They had marched into war believing in German efficiency, the precision of Krupp steel, the genius of their general staff. Yet here was a democracy that built not in hundreds but in tens of thousands. A single American plant in Detroit could outproduce an entire year of German tank manufacture. One factory shift made more trucks than some divisions ever saw in their lifetimes. The sensory contrast was just as jarring. The smell of hot tar and diesel in U.S. motor pools was constant, thick as a storm cloud. Forklifts screeched, cranes swung, soldiers shouted over clanging steel. To the prisoners, the sound itself was crushing, a music of endless capacity. They knew by then that no tactic, no heroic stand could match such arithmetic. A prisoner named Hans, once a machinist in Bremen, whispered to his guard as another convoy rolled past, "We counted every bolt. You do not count at all." The guard only grinned, flicking away his half-smoked Lucky Strike. For Hans, the casual gesture stung more than any insult. America wasted more than Germany produced. The chapter of the war was turning. By 1945, these numbers were no longer abstractions, but realities that shaped every battlefield. Where Germany rationed fuel, Americans ran engines all night. Where Wehrmacht units fought with patched boots and dwindling shells, U.S. divisions rotated fresh men, fresh equipment, fresh supplies. Standing at the fence line, watching a train of Shermans vanish into the horizon, one German officer finally understood. This was not war as he had studied it in academies. This was war as a factory line, and America's factory line had no end. It began long before the first shot was fired. In December 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt addressed the nation and declared the United States would become the arsenal of democracy. Few could have imagined how literally that promise would be fulfilled. By 1944, American industry was not merely supporting its own armies, but supplying half the free world with the tools of liberation. Detroit, once the city of automobiles, had transformed overnight. Ford's Willow Run plant alone turned out a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Chevrolet and Chrysler poured tanks and trucks down assembly lines once devoted to sedans. A single American steel mill outproduced Germany's entire annual tank program. Civilian workers, housewives, farmers, immigrants, clocked shifts that stretched night into day. Their calloused hands fed Patton's advance, Eisenhower's air fleets, and even the cigarettes in a POW's pocket. The statistics seemed impossible. American war production dwarfed the Axis at every turn, 3 times more aircraft than Germany, 5 times more trucks than Japan, 10 times more merchant shipping than Italy. A nation that had fewer than 200,000 soldiers in 1939 fielded more than 12 million by 1945, all clothed, fed, and armed by the machine of democracy. On the factory floor, the rhythm was relentless. Riveters hammered fuselages under showers of sparks. Conveyor belts carried tank hulls down lines as if they were ordinary consumer goods. A welder in overalls, never having set foot in Europe, unknowingly shaped the armor plate that would one day cross the Rhine at Remagen. The connection was invisible, yet absolute. The citizen worker was as much a soldier as the infantrymen in foxholes abroad. German prisoners who glimpsed American cities by rail were stunned. The streets teemed with cars despite gasoline rationing. Storefronts glowed with neon, their shelves lined with goods untouched by scarcity. Even the music drifting from radios, jazz, swing, big band, spoke of a nation confident enough to dance while producing war on an industrial scale. This was the democracy they had been told was weak. Instead, it revealed its greatest strength, the ability to mobilize not by decree, but by consent. Ordinary men and women volunteered extra shifts, bought war bonds, planted victory gardens. It was not fear that drove them, but conviction. The arsenal of democracy was more than steel and oil. It was belief that free people could outproduce tyrants. As one German officer would later admit, "We fought soldiers. We lost to workers." In that single sentence lay the truth. America's might came not only from weapons, but from the democratic spirit that built them. The years had blurred into decades, but the memory had never left him. In the 1990s, Günter Grove stood in a community hall in Washington state, his hair silver now, his frame bent with age. Before him sat Americans who had once been his guards, farmers who had hired him in their fields, townsfolk who had watched the prisoners march down Iowa roads. He cleared his throat, voice breaking with emotion. "I never forgot," he said quietly. "Thank you, America." His journey had begun on the blasted bocage of Normandy, where a chocolate bar and a cigarette had upended everything he believed about his enemy. Years of captivity in the United States had followed, years where he ate more than his family back home, earned pay for honest labor, and discovered that even as a prisoner he was treated with dignity. He had expected vengeance. Instead, he found fairness. The numbers were astonishing. Between 1942 and 1946, over 425,000 Axis prisoners were held in the United States, 371,000 of them German. They were housed in more than 700 camps, spread across 46 states. Yet records show that, by and large, they were fed the same rations as American soldiers, given access to libraries, music, even art supplies. For many, it was their first encounter with democracy, not as an idea, but as a daily lived experience. Growe remembered the shock of the canteen shelves, Coca-Cola bottles lined up in neat rows, cigarettes sold by the pack, ice cream scooped in generous portions. He recalled the nativity in Algona, the plaster figures glowing in the lamplight, while snow fell outside the wire. He remembered harvest days in Iowa, where American farm wives handed him sandwiches as if he were a neighbor. And he remembered the overwhelming sight of convoys, the deuce and a halves rolling endlessly, the trucks filled with more than his country could ever hope to supply. These memories had haunted him more than battles. They forced him to ask hard questions when he returned home. What kind of system had promised victory through brutality, yet starved its own citizens, while the enemy offered even its captives abundance? What did it mean that the greatest humiliation of his life, defeat, was bound forever to the greatest act of generosity he had ever known. Now, as he faced the Americans once more, Grawe felt tears sting his eyes. He had fought against them as a young man. He had lived among them as a captive. And now, as an old man, he thanked them as friends. His final words that evening were simple, stripped of pride, born of gratitude. "You showed me what greatness truly means." The story of German prisoners in America is not written in battle maps or casualty charts, but in smaller, quieter images. A Hershey bar pressed into a trembling hand in Normandy. A Liberty ship sliding into the water while prisoners whispered that they could never sink them fast enough. Ice cream melting in Texas heat as POWs laughed at their luck. A nativity scene glowing in an Iowa winter, crafted by men who once carried rifles for Hitler. These moments, ordinary and impossible at once, carried a truth greater than any weapon. By 1945, the scale was undeniable. America had fielded 12 million service members, produced 85,000 aircraft in a single year, 49,000 Shermans over the war, more than 500,000 trucks, and 2,710 Liberty ships. The Red Ball Express alone hauled 412,000 tons of supplies in 82 days. A single steel mill in Pennsylvania outproduced Germany's entire tank program. America wasted more fuel idling in convoys than Germany allocated to whole armies. These were not just statistics, they were the arithmetic of victory. The prisoners saw it firsthand. They saw that democracy had turned workers into warriors without a uniform, that factories had become battlegrounds, and that generosity was as much a weapon as artillery. They learned that America's power lay not in cruelty, but in its ability to extend dignity even to its enemies. For many Germans, it was the turning point of their lives. They returned home after the war carrying not just extra weight from camp rations, but memories of fairness, abundance, and respect. Some became leaders in rebuilding West Germany, their admiration for American democracy planted in the soil of captivity. Others, like Günter Grawe, would spend their lives telling anyone who asked why he believed America was the greatest nation on earth. The irony was bitter, yet profound. Nazi propaganda had promised a decadent America, weak and divided, unfit for war. What German soldiers discovered instead was an America that built weapons faster than they could be destroyed, shipped supplies in quantities beyond calculation, and still found the generosity to share chocolate, cigarettes, and Coca-Cola with the men who had tried to kill them. History records the great battles, Normandy, the Bulge, Remagen, but for thousands of prisoners, the true revelation came in the camps, in the warehouses, in the canteens. They saw that freedom itself, when armed with industry and conviction, was an arsenal that no dictatorship could outlast. As the war faded into memory, one truth endured. America's greatness was not just measured in bombs dropped or ships launched, but in the simple act of treating even enemies as human beings. That was the weapon no tyranny could match.